Ya entramos a YouTube. Raquel, tú me dices cuándo inicio.
Sí, ya estamos.
¿Se inicia? Ok, bueno. Buenas noches, sean ustedes bienvenidos a la sesión 280 de la Academia Nacional de Arquitectura, capítulo Monterrey. Agradecemos a todos los que hacen posible que el capítulo siga trabajando para alcanzar el objetivo de conocer, reconocer y dar a conocer la arquitectura contemporánea. Muy especialmente a los amigos de la Academia por su constante apoyo. Agradecemos a los amigos BIP de la Academia, Armstrong, Cemex, Crest, Gilsa, Interceramic y Versitalia, así como a nuestros amigos Cubrelam, Natusi, Panel Rey y Vidrios El Castillo. Asimismo, agradecemos hoy la presencia, tanto en la plataforma Zoom como en YouTube, de los directores y directoras de las universidades participantes en la 15ª edición del concurso Gran Premio de Arquitectura Joven, que organiza el capítulo Monterrey de la Academia Nacional de Arquitectura y que hoy nos acompaña. Los invito a que nos sigan en nuestras redes sociales y a que se suscriban a nuestra página de web www.anamti.org y a nuestro canal de YouTube, donde pueden consultar todas nuestras sesiones. Siendo las 19:03 del día 7 de marzo del año 2022, tengo el gusto de abrir esta sesión ordinaria número 280 de la Academia Nacional de Arquitectura, capítulo Monterrey, bienio 2021-2023. Saludo y doy la bienvenida esta noche a académicos, arquitectos, profesores y estudiantes, amigos de la Academia y miembros de nuestra comunidad que esta noche nos acompañan por las plataformas Zoom y YouTube. Agradezco muy especialmente al arquitecto Charles Waldheim, director de la Oficina de Urbanización de la Universidad de Harvard, que haya aceptado nuestra invitación a participar con nosotros vía Zoom desde la ciudad de Cambridge, en Estados Unidos. Damos asimismo la bienvenida a los directores de las distintas universidades de la ciudad que hoy nos acompañan. A la doctora María Teresa Ledesma Elizondo, directora de la Facultad de Arquitectura de la UANL. Al arquitecto Juan Carlos López Amador y a la doctora Karen Hinojosa, directores de los programas de Arquitectura y Urbanismo, respectivamente, del TEC de Monterrey. A la arquitecta Rosaura Guadalupe López Pérez, directora del Programa Académico de Arquitectura del UDEM, así como a la arquitecta Jessica Méndez, directora de Arquitectura y Urbanismo del CEDIM. A la arquitecta Natalia Isabel Silva Pérez, directora de Arquitectura de la Universidad Metropolitana de Monterrey. A la arquitecta Rosa María Thompson, coordinadora de Arquitectura de la UVM. Y a la arquitecta Berta Solís Martínez, del Programa de Arquitectura de la Universidad de Monterrey, UR. Cedo ahora la palabra a la arquitecta Rena Porsen Overgaard, secretaria de este capítulo.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches tengan todos ustedes. Damos la bienvenida a quienes esta tarde nos acompañan por las plataformas de YouTube y de Zoom. Queremos hacer una solicitud muy puntual. Por respeto a los ponentes y a la audiencia que hoy nos acompaña, agradecemos que nuestros invitados de la plataforma Zoom mantengan su micrófono apagado durante todo el transcurso de la sesión. Podrán encenderlo una vez que se les conceda la palabra durante la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Doy la palabra a la arquitecta Penélope Montes González, cronista de la Academia, que nos va a presentar un resumen de la relatoría de la sesión anterior.
Buenas noches. Bueno, en la sesión 279 tuvimos la presencia de Raymond Jungels, que nos dictó su ponencia Raymond Jungels en México y más allá. Nos presentó 12 proyectos, todos ellos muy interesantes, algunos en Monterrey, como el proyecto Ventana de la Montaña Jardín, un proyecto en Chipinque, donde la mayoría de la vegetación estaba constituida por los encinos y la topografía del sitio. Nos mencionó a Luis Barragán como su primera influencia y ese acercamiento que tiene con el agua, a la que se considera el corazón y el alma del jardín. En el proyecto se detallaron árboles, algunos sembrados por el padre del cliente, y también se utilizaron materiales locales. Nos mencionó dentro de su proceso de diseño el trazado sobre fotografías o sobre el sitio, además de diseñar directamente en las visitas durante la construcción. Nos mencionó que uno de los principios de sus diseños es difuminar el adentro y el afuera en una integración, crear experiencias variadas en los jardines con diferentes escalas y materiales, conectar el hard space con plantas y las vistas al Cerro de las Mitras y a la ciudad, que en algún momento le recordaban las montañas en las afueras de Los Ángeles por su espectacularidad. También mencionó que las plantas eran abordadas como notas musicales a partir de sus texturas, colores, y que eso las hacía leerse de varias maneras. También nos presentó el jardín del Alear, un trabajo en colaboración con el despacho de Landa Martínez, de Agustín Landa, padre e hijo. Es un conjunto de casas entre una calle pues ruidosa y otra callada. Se estudiaron circulaciones entre lobbies y diferentes alturas entre los 4 edificios, y el jardín cubre gran parte de la estructura. Cuenta con una entrada para desaceleración, porque los autos circulan con gran velocidad, así como una rampa de circulación junto a una escalera, dando esta sensación de flotar entre los niveles. Presentó también el jardín de la Casa Tara, un jardín privado de una recámara principal con spa y cascadas. Se construyó una banqueta arbolada para mejorar el ambiente de las personas que circulaban alrededor del predio, dándole una mejora a estos usuarios y una mayor privacidad a la propiedad. Resaltó el rescate de un viejo encino siempre verde del terreno vecino, donde se respetaron las raíces para construir la entrada de la casa. Y bueno, nos comentaba su generalmente coreografía de plantas para mitigar la altura de los muros que le dan privacidad al edificio. También mencionó el uso de la palma washingtona, que crece en Monterrey y que forma parte del jardín, y los encinos siempre verdes para focalizar el arribo a áreas de recreación. Comentó que le gusta ajustar la escala de los elementos del paisaje a la arquitectura para sintonizar el diseño y hacer parecer que una sola persona fue el diseñador, y a partir de esto unificar la experiencia. También nos presentó otros proyectos como el Jardín Group Studio, que es parte de sus oficinas, un estudio con una premisa de crear un jardín en la ciudad, prácticamente vivir en el bosque dentro de una ciudad o metrópoli. Construyeron nuevas banquetas que funcionan como parque, donde se puede pasear al perro, así como comedores al exterior para los empleados. Mencionó también el uso del agua en el proyecto para disminuir el sonido del tráfico exterior, además de abonar con arte, en particular esculturas, en algunos de los jardines. Después, bueno, esto fue en la etapa de proyectos fuera de México. También en Miami nos mencionó varios proyectos que estaba realizando con grandes despachos de arquitectos como Gerson de Meuron y de Norman Foster, el 1111 de la calle Lincoln. Es un estacionamiento en un edificio antiguo que pretendía tener más funciones que solamente el aparcamiento. Está en el distrito histórico de Miami Beach. Se pueden realizar, por ejemplo, eventos como bodas en algunos de sus niveles, y en la parte superior se creó una jungla con plantas nativas, además de conjuntos de agua con peces, tortugas y otras vidas silvestres. El Sky Garden del edificio es una vivienda en la azotea de este edificio de estacionamiento con un mirador hacia la ciudad. se trazó un área, se trajo, perdón, un árbol de Brasil llamado acacia, y bueno, reina en este ambiente la sensación de paz, quietud y aislamiento. También comentó algunos otros proyectos como el jardín de Faena House o el de Jade Signature, el jardín Pine Tree North, el jardín Golden Rock Inn, algunos de ellos que presentaban, por ejemplo, la utilización de agua en el jardín, las rampas como un elemento para dar privacidad, y concluyó con la Ford Foundation en Nueva York, que es un proyecto dedicado exclusivo para recrear el bosque en la ciudad. Después de la presentación vino una sesión de preguntas y respuestas donde algunos de los señalamientos de Raymond fueron para los estudiantes mantener su curiosidad, un gran interés en preservar lo natural, desarrollar un poder de observación y sobre todo investigar sobre plantas nativas. Y bueno, mi conclusión de la ponencia es que, bueno, la fusión de la arquitectura de paisaje y en el edificio siempre va a buscar pues una sintonía, ¿no? de proyectos y de oportunidades. También Raymond mencionó que, bueno, él era un gran admirador de la arquitectura y que solamente por esta vía del diseño de paisaje podía relacionarse con diseños tan diversos y cooperar para su mejor asertividad. Gracias.
A continuación, voy a dar una breve semblanza de nuestro invitado Charles Waldheim. Él es un arquitecto y urbanista de Estados Unidos con sede de Cambridge, Massachusetts, donde es profesor John E. Ewing en la Escuela de Graduados de Diseño de la Universidad de Harvard. Y él ahí dirige la oficina de urbanización de la misma escuela. También se desempeña como curador de paisajes rochas en el Museo de Isabel Stewart Gardner en Boston, donde convoca The Bigger Conversation Landscape. A través de sus líneas de investigación, Charles Waldheim se sitúa como uno de los arquitectos que se ha dedicado a descifrar y explicarnos las nuevas realidades de la ciudad contemporánea. Concretamente, Waldheim examina las relaciones entre el paisaje, la ecología y el urbanismo contemporáneo, donde los asentamientos humanos se leen como parte de grandes sistemas de paisajes, infraestructuras, que nos lleva a mirar nuestro contexto físico en una serie de nuevas ideas de la morfología de la ciudad. En particular, Waldheim desarrolló la teoría del urbanismo paisajístico en relación a las economías industriales y las ecologías emergentes de la ciudad estadounidense. Sobre ese tema, también es curador de la plataforma Future of the American City de Harvard, con apoyo de la Fundación Knight. Quiero también agregar que es un gran especialista de todo el tema de Detroit y lo que ha pasado en Detroit. Además, Charles Waldheim es autor, editor o coeditor de numerosos libros y explicaciones sobre el tema, incluyendo Landscape as Urbanism, a General Theory, y The Landscape Urbanism Reader. Waldheim ha recibido la beca del Premio Roma de la Arquitectura Americana en Roma, la beca de investigación Visiting Scholar en el Centro Canadiense de Arquitectura, la beca Sanders de la Universidad de Michigan y la cátedra Cullinan en la Universidad de Rice. Ha sido profesor visitante en la Architectural Association School of Architecture of London y la Bauhaus Foundation de Dessau, Alemania. Además de su investigación, Waldheim asesora a clientes públicos y privados en cuestiones de urbanismo contemporáneo y colabora con equipos multidisciplinarios en proyectos urbanos en todo el mundo. Su trabajo ha sido publicado, exhibido y presentado internacionalmente y ha colaborado en proyectos urbanos con una gran variedad de diseñadores líderes, incluyendo la OMA, Morphosis, Gross, Max, Preston Scott Cohen, Stossard Landscape Urbanism, y James Cornerfield's Operation, entre otros. Welcome, Charles, and we're looking very forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Reina. That was very kind, and it was also very long, and I'm hopeful it's all true, but it's really a pleasure to be with you and Jorge and everyone. Thanks to the Academia Nacional de Arquitectura Capítulo Monterrey for the invitation. This series that you've been hosting for over 25 years is really an impressive piece of work, and I hope to be able to do justice to your invitation in the coming minutes. I'll begin by just describing briefly the work that we've been up to. The work that I'll share with you this evening is the work of a collaborative research group that I lead at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. We're called the Office for Urbanization. And we are most often working with communities, we're working with NGOs, we're working with various philanthropic organizations, and we're typically advising cities on the choices that they face. We're advising them on the kinds of choices that they might make in the built environment. This particular project, 50 Species Towns, is the resultant of a 4-year research project looking at agricultural new towns across China. That's a very different context than Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's a very different context than Monterrey, Mexico. But I do believe there are some aspects of this which might be shared or of mutual interest. The work is also the result of a collaboration with my core team, and this includes Charlie Gaillard, Mariano Gomez-Luque, Mercedes Peralta, Min Yao, and Boya Zhang, among many, many other research associates and research assistants. It is a proposition in the form of a book as a counter proposal to the dominant form of agricultural new towns that we see in China today, a new paradigm for the development of agricultural new towns. We imagine an approach to these new towns based on the concept of heritage crops. These heritage crops, we'll say more about in a moment, but they have quite a lot to do with the history of this place and of this people. These 50 most important significant crops and their material cultures we view as unique and invaluable forms of cultural heritage. And we've done quite a lot of work over the past several years to understand those. It's our view that the urban and agricultural imaginary, the way that we live in the countryside, has been shaped in various eras with certain imaginaries, certain images about how we might live. China's culture is no different than any other culture in that regard. And so it's important for us to begin with an understanding of the ways in which Chinese agricultural development has been developed, but also the ways in which images of that prospect have been made as a form of propaganda. We see something similar today in real estate ads for contemporary urban projects. Our project is a response to the 2016 publication, the 13th five-year plan for economic and social development of the People's Republic. So our proposal is a counter proposal, you might say, with respect to that five-year plan. That five-year plan proposed, and we've now seen the development of a series of modernization programs across China focusing on the countryside. That plan, for example, called to improve the rural working conditions and living standards across the country, to cultivate and develop specialized economies, to characterize local areas, and to develop eco-friendly agricultural techniques. You might think of this as the Chinese doing two things at the same time. First, modernizing agriculture, bringing agricultural into the economy. The village had been one of the only areas of modern life that was not a part of the new capitalist economy in China. But at the same time, while they're bringing into the 20th century monoculture crops and genetically modified crops and all sorts of techniques to optimize production, they're also trying to do so in a more environmentally or ecologically literate way. The party have proposed a close cooperation between agricultural forms, but also leisure, tourism, education, culture, and public health. And a part of what they're trying to do is to integrate the agricultural sector into information technology, into management operations, and into the overall economy nationally. They will say, as they proposed, the complete mechanization of the production of major crops, and those 4 major crops include rice, wheat, corn, and soy. And our proposal is that in doing so, they will ultimately run the risk of erasing quite valuable cultural heritage. In order to do that project, they will, of course, have to strengthen their water management programs, develop parks and a series of green strategies. They will, of course, need urban and rural infrastructure to integrate the agricultural economy into the national economy. One of the challenges that the Chinese face in this work is the economic disparity between the poverty in the countryside and the wealth in the city. This is producing all sorts of public health outcomes, but also incredible social dysfunction, social inequity. And in that social inequity, of course, one of the desires of this project is to mitigate or lessen the economic and social inequity between those 2 cultures. We believe that this approach to a monoculture poses a great threat to Chinese agricultural heritage and Chinese heritage more broadly. We've done quite a lot of work to study internal migration patterns and to understand the economy of how and who might live in these places. We've also done quite a lot to understand what might make these places attractive places for people to live. And we've arrived at this topic known as intangible cultural heritage. Intangible cultural heritage is a UNESCO metric. UNESCO has worldwide surveys of this. And we've worked very closely with UNESCO statistics and data in terms of intangible cultural heritage, but also with Chinese literature. In this regard, the Chinese literature is quite clear, and we've identified from the list of quite vulnerable Chinese heritage crop, those 50 that are the most vulnerable. In this regard, we begin with a precedent project. This is a project by Kong Jianyu. His firm is called Turinscape. Kong Jianyu is among the most important landscape architects working in China today. Kong Jianyu developed almost 20 years ago this project for the Shenyang University, the so-called Shenyang Rice Campus. Kong Jianyu received the commission for the design of this campus after the master planning had been done and the buildings were largely underway, and there was no budget left for landscape. And in lieu of, or instead of, building a new green campus in the Western model, Kong Jianyu proposed going back to the legacy crops, the history of this place that had been erased. And he reinstalled on the campus a functioning wet rice paddy complex in which the rice becomes not only the material fabric of the campus itself, but also becomes the identity of the place. It becomes the celebratory occasions during the year. It becomes the mascot for the sports team. It's sold in the university bookstore. So in this regard, this Shenyang Architectural University campus has become a kind of precedent for us. The idea of having a, how do you say, a mascota crop. The idea of the mascota as a kind of symbol, because no one wants to live in Newtown 427B. We've organized our thoughts with respect to the most valuable and the most vulnerable of these heritage crops. And we've proposed a counter program of 50 new towns. These are relatively small, 30 to 50,000 people, let's say, in the manner of the new economic program, and spread across the geography of China based on latitude, geology, soils, and the like. In this case, I'll not present all 50, but rather give you 3 in the course of a kind of tasting menu. In each case, we used the thought experiment, what could we do to organize this new town from the point of view of the species out? So every decision in terms of its location, its physiognomy, its color scheme, its solar orientation, its altitude, its latitude, all of these we're trying to derive not from the conditions of economy, not from infrastructure, but rather from the logic of the species themselves. The first of these that I'll share with you this evening is the Jujube, or the Chinese date. The Chinese date grows in a northern latitude between 29 and 50 degrees north in a temperate or semi-arid climate. It's native to Jia County, and Jia County have cultivated jujube fruit for over 3,000 years. We're interested here, of course, in the cultural festivals around the jujube race cake, but also the kind of color and the texture of this lived experience. You can see here the jujube cake feast in Jia County and the kind of extraordinary cultural experience. Having grown the jujube here for over 3,000 years, there are trees producing to this day that are nearly 1,000 years old. The jujube fruit has more vitamin C than the orange, more sugar than the sugar cane, and yet it grows in arid conditions where more commercial varieties cannot survive. And in each of these cases, we're deriving a color palette, but we're looking also at the material conditions and the lived experience of living with this Chinese date. We're deriving from the date and the growth of the species a growth logic, or a kind of morphology, in which we're interested to press on the origins of urban form. If urban form here is not given by the law of the Indies or the notion of some abstract ordering, the division of property, might it be possible for us to derive a growth logic for the city from the growth of the species itself? We're also interested in the architectonic form, or the urban form, of each of these particular locations. In the literature, there are 18 particular village types across China. In this case, the so-called skinny courtyard is an important residence form or typology in Guangzhou, historically associated with the Chinese date in Jia County. In lieu of traditional typological analysis, which we found in the published works, we decided to do scans, and you can see here, dozens and dozens of examples of actual building types and block structures that we've scanned from across this region of China. And on the left, you can see here a kind of X-ray, kind of aggregate of those various studies. We're interested here in the relationship between the ideal type, the ideal form, and the range of its expression, the variability of its expression. From that typological study, we then adapt our own block structures in keeping with the typology of the region. And then from that, try to grow a new town, initially in an ideal kind of tabletop exercise, but then applying that to a particular geography, a particular geology, a particular hydrology, and then try to imagine, well, what might life be like in such a new town living around the Chinese date. In this regard, we're also interested in the morphologies, or the overall structure of village life. The literature on this topic is quite readily available in both Mandarin and English. There are essentially three spatial structures associated with the north, the center, and the south of China. The northern village is traditionally clustered. The central Chinese village is traditional linear pattern, and the southern is typically a so-called spotted pattern. And again, what we did was we ground truthed that with dozens and dozens of examples of studying actual villages so as to derive patterns that might be more specifically sympathetic with Chinese lived experience. To that, we bring our own tools. In the Office for Urbanization, we're interested in climate. We work backwards from the Köppen-Geiger climate zones to then look at solar orientation, latitude, and then a range of parametric or rule-based strategies for developing urban form, and then a distribution of program across that urban form to sponsor new forms of life, new forms of occasion. Those new towns are then interspersed with photographic portfolios. We find it really important in our work not only to think about the imaginary, the future possibility, alternative and better urban futures. We think of it as our work to try to visualize those possibilities, but it's equally important for us to compare that with the existing condition, let's say the reality on the ground. In this case, I'll share with you the photographic portfolio of the photographer Zhao Zhu, who's been doing work in China documenting what agricultural life is like for some Chinese over the past several years. And this is a useful way for us to think about the lived experience on the ground, the hardship, the material conditions, the humidity, the drought, and to be a little bit closer to the conditions on the ground. You can see here, these are photographs taken in Guangzhou, Haibai, and Xinji. Second is the rapeseed. The rapeseed grows in the continental winter dry climate zone and is primarily used in the production of canola oil, which is a certain kind of vegetable oil that's quite important. You can see here the Zhongshan show in the rapeseed oil field. And this combination of rapeseed production combined with agroecological mixing of fish aquaculture, kind of fish cultivation, producing both the roasted rapeseed that you see here, but equally an extraordinary kind of biodynamic relationship between fish farming and dryland farming. Again, these patterns of agriculture are thousands of years old, and from that we derive a kind of unique morphology and typology of both kind of urban form and village structure, bringing those together into a proposition for a new form of rapeseed village, and then again brought to a unique climate, a unique geology, and distributed across this set of productive fields. You can see here, in this case, the Guangzhou skinny courtyard on the top left. On the top over here on the right, you can see the ideal plan. We're interested in typology. We're interested in the idealization, let's say, of certain physiognomy, certain building bodies. But we find that the history of typology in our field is dominated by ideal bodies, perfect bodies. And we feel very strongly that actual real bodies are much more interesting than perfect bodies. And so on the left, you can see at the top left, the Guangzhou skinny courtyard and its range of variability as compared with the ideal plan. This is a little bit like a shift from the ideal Vitruvian man to something like public health, where we're looking at an entire population. And we now have these tools to be able to scan entire villages, entire regions, entire counties, or entire countries of buildings so as to understand something like their population health, their width, their breadth, their variety, and their variability. You can see here on the right, the organization of those relative to solar orientation and at latitude. And we've done this across these 18 types. It's something that I find really quite fascinating to be able to use machine learning technology, in this case, to train a machine to be able to understand and then to anticipate the patterns, the typological patterns. You can see here the Huzhu skywell, again, the ideal type from the literature of the 1980s on the right, and the scanned examples found in the world on the left. Or the Fujian Toulouse, this very kind of canonical circular form, and then the range of variability found in the wild or in the world, let's say. Another photographic portfolio, in this case, the work of Toole and Bruno Morandi, who have also been photographing the conditions in China. In this case, the idea of the tea economy and tea culture in relationship to the harvesting of kind of terraced tea cultivation, which is of course thousands of years old in China as well. You can see this in this series, all from Sichuan province. And then finally, the Tianjin pepper. You can see on this landing page, we're interested in the color of the material. We have a little map showing not only the range of where this particular pepper is cultivated in China, but also its elevation, its forms of soil and climate. And you can see at the bottom a little quote we've pulled, in this case, Mao Zedong himself, saying that the food of the true revolutionary is the red pepper. and he cannot endure red peppers is unable to fight. I'm not sure if that's true. We think that Mao said it, and we think it's interesting, therefore, in terms of its cultural history. And you can see here the impact of this kind of experience, this kind of pepper and its coloring, in this case, the Tianjin pepper, not being native to China, right? That in fact is coming from the subtropical humid climate, grows in southern latitudes, native originally to Latin America, Bolivia, Paraguay. Tianjin pepper was introduced to China in the 15th and 16th century. In this case, again, an interest in the patterns of cultivation and the patterns of growth and the nature of agricultural work, but its relationship then to the kind of urban pattern or growth. In this case, the Hunan big house was a type that was quite hard to get our hands around. It was relatively rare, took an astonishing variety of forms, but was equally informative to our own development. And then in this case, a kind of pod-like urban structure we've developed in relationship to the pod-like growth of the Tianjin red pepper. In addition to a proposal or a counter-proposal for our friends in China, we're also hoping that this offers a kind of alternative to and a critique implicitly and explicitly to the relative failures of modernization projects of the previous century. We think that it's quite possible and utterly unfortunate that the Chinese might repeat the mistakes that we've made in the United States as we modernized our agricultural production and erased such a vast amount of our intangible cultural heritage and our culinary heritage in particular. We think of this proposal as an approach. It's a set of explorations and speculative design methods that can also be applicable or useful or relevant in other places in a range of different contexts. But ultimately for us, our recommendation is that we think about the role of culinary heritage and the role of intangible cultural heritage as a form of resistance or place-based specificity in relationship to these larger projects of urbanization that we might hope to resist. So thanks so very much for having us. Of course, we look forward to a conversation with you and your colleagues. And it's been a great pleasure to share this work with you, and we'll look forward to chatting with you about it.
Thank you very much, Charles, for this presentation, which is really very enlightening and impressive, considering all the graphics and information. Wonderful. And we start with questions and answers, first with the people here with us at the Zoom platform. Comenzamos con preguntas y respuestas para el arquitecto Charles Waldheim, comenzando por los que estamos aquí reunidos en la plataforma. Si alguien quiere extender alguna pregunta, ya tengo algunas de YouTube, pero comenzamos con las de los asistentes, por favor. Pueden hacerla directamente o levantar la mano, como gusten. Ok, bueno, comienzo con una de las preguntas de YouTube. Nos preguntan si dentro de este nuevo paradigma que presenta Charles Waldheim, piensa que en un futuro las personas, como algunos teóricos lo han dicho, van a abandonar las ciudades en una realidad post-urbana. ¿Cuál es su pensamiento al respecto? What do you think, Charles, about people leaving the urban cities in terms of the periphery or the campo? Your microphone.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's an interesting one. You know, I think we have done, you know, quite a lot of work on the formerly urban or the post-urban, you know, kind of urban abandonment. You know, the factories and the industries that are thriving around Monterey. Many of them had formerly been in the Great Lakes. They had been formerly in the United States, and so that's an interesting topic for us in our work. But in this context, in this project, you know, it's not as though these cities, the major cities especially, will be slowing down anytime soon. In fact, quite the contrary. I think the Chinese, policy has a couple of goals. One of these is the economic disparity between living in the countryside and living in the city is quite strained, and it produces a number of social problems, social pathologies. You have many people moving to the city to work, leaving the grandparents, the abuelos, and the children back home, and this produces all sorts of lost generation concerns about education and public health. The Chinese are trying to deal with this. They're also trying to encourage some people to stay on the farm, if you will, to reduce pressure on the cities, but also to encourage some people to leave the cities, a small number, to move back to the countryside, maybe people that have done well, and some mix of people that are retiring, some mix of people that are looking for a more restful or a more touristic kind of life, combined with improving the living conditions for people that are living in the village. I think it's a societal and economic approach first, but I think the Chinese city is going to continue to grow, and this will hopefully take some of the pressure off of that growth. But I don't see people leaving the city anytime soon.
Rena, ¿tienes la mano arriba?
Sí. Okay, I would like you, I think it's a very, very interesting idea of using these original crops as a way of exploring a new way of developing rural areas. I would like if you would comment a bit, how would that be done in America? I mean, not in the US, mm-hmm. but in America as a continent, because I think we have the same problems with the growth of the cities as in China. But I also think that we are being a lot poorer of planning these. So I see a lot of potential of this idea in this sort of suburban growth. Particularly here in Monterrey, we have these big gaps between different city areas, semi-rural. And we have the same problems in the whole continent of this lack of good use of the historical crops and to maintain people working on the rural areas. So I would like if you would comment a bit on that, please.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Rena. I think it's an important question, and it's one of the reasons we took up this project, because I think while the Chinese have their challenges, they also at least are attempting to try to address them in certain ways. I know that of course they have their own political challenges and their own human rights abuses and environmental challenges, but frankly depending upon what's going on in our society at any given moment, I can't say that we are any better prepared to respond either. I would say this, there's a generation, or now two maybe, of chefs in America who will say they rather than owning a French restaurant in the capital, they would rather own a farm. So what you refer to as the slow food movement, or what came out of Europe in the 1960s and 70s, I'm thinking about French and Italian slow food movement as a kind of political project, and its reception in the US. We now have a generation or two generations of chefs who have been radicalized around this idea of sourcing their own materials. And that stands in a kind of resistance, in a way, a kind of cultural resistance or alternative to the dominant economy of our food culture, which is, as you know, industrially produced, quasi poisonous, producing all sorts of public health outcomes, etc. So that the industrial food economy is one of the primary agendas here. My goal is to have a generation of architects and landscape architects who would also like to own a farm. I think the idea of us sourcing our own material is important here, and a kind of alliance you might think about. I'm interested also in ways of approaching the category of the region I don't know the situation in the north of Mexico as well as you do, but in our culture, we've become so allergic to the idea of regionalism. It's been so exhausted in a way. I've been in my own formation kind of allergic to the idea that, certain people live in certain places and this region has a certain native species or native plant. And, ultimately, I think this is one of the ideas that we have to confront very, very directly because, the state that I live in has a list of plants that are illegal for me to grow because they're not, quote, native. This kind of thinking, of course, is racist when we apply it to human beings. For me, I'm interested in the Enlightenment as an incomplete project. I believe the more that we can mix, the more that we can have conversations like this, the more that we can, move and become educated. And there are challenges with that. There are limits to that project because that kind of movement, the Enlightenment project of mixing and sharing and us growing together, it also produces erasure, right? I think that there's a project of the Enlightenment that's not just about colonialism. So in this regard, I'm interested in a new way of approaching specificity of place, but without the baggage of a kind of regionalism, without being contextual or stylistic. So in that sense, I'm interested in climate for obvious reasons. We're all interested in climate today, but thinking about climate as a way to be specific to place, because these plants, I'm no expert in Chinese food, but I know that if you've been eating this plant for 3,000 years, and if you've built, ceremonies and opera and paintings off of this, this is deeply meaningful to people. And so I'm looking for something that will allow us to be specific to a place without being stylistic, without adopting a superficial kind of image of the place. And that is a kind of modernity, let's say. So applying it to the context of the Americas, Mexico, United States, it begins with establishing limits on the industrial food, economy, placing both spatial and economic limits on the public health impacts of those activities. We're pouring, subsidies into to grow wheat and corn and soy. Those economic subsidies are putting fertilizer on the Mississippi River. That fertilizer ends up in the Gulf of Mexico, and both Mexico and the U.S. deals with this hyper eutrophication, right? Those kinds of things. By finding local specific species that can be a point of resistance culturally. And in that point of resistance, maybe try to build an urban, let's say, culture from that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Tengo otra pregunta de YouTube, la voy a mencionar. Pregunta el arquitecto Mario Guillén. Mario Ricardo Santiago, perdón, pregunta sobre qué ocurre en el entorno donde se desarrolla lo urbano o qué ha visto usted, Charles Waldheim, en ese entorno respecto al cambio de vida del contraste entre el estatus social de lo urbano y lo rural dentro del contexto de la ciudad y sus cambios en diversidad cultural. Creo que va muy relacionado con esos cambios de la migración de la ciudad y el enfrentamiento entre lo urbano y lo rural dentro del territorio de la ciudad. Basically, your perspective on the contrast of the living in a city between the people which inhabit the city and the new people arriving in the city from the rural places, particularly in China and also in any context in America.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. I would say, cities are objects of desire. They're not rational, but they tend to be both economic magnets, but they're also, cultural and educational magnets. And we come together to live in cities, and that affords a certain quality of life. But for too long, our culture has imagined that you move to the city and you get some economic benefit, or maybe you can send your kids to college, or maybe you can enjoy a different quality of life. And that's a kind of one direction or one moment in your life migration. I think what the Chinese understand, and what I think we're understanding in the US these days, is that it's much more of a cycle. and that cycle is not available to all classes. But to the extent our economy depends upon, in the case of, China, migrations internal to China, people leaving the village for industrial activity in the cities, this produces all sorts of social pathologies back on the farm, and that we have to be kind of aware of this. And in the United States, as our agricultural economy depends fundamentally on Mexican labor and the labor of millions of Americans from across Latin America, we have to acknowledge this, and we have to both enable that, but also support it, as opposed to being in denial with it. It is true that newcomers to the city will put additional pressures of various kinds on the existing situation, and it's also true that the most vocal critics of any situation are the people who got here most recently. In any American city, you can say it was great until 10 years ago when everyone else arrived. And I think in that context, one of our goals is to be thinking about the shape of the city in anticipation of that growth, right? I mean, our biggest challenge right now is we are in a kind of denial about the growth of cities and these migratory patterns, and we tend to be surprised when people show up, and therefore we're kind of reacting, playing defense in response to things that are happening. And 100 years ago, in a city like Cambridge, Massachusetts, that was not the case, right? We were inventing new strategies. We were well out ahead of the growth of the city, planning for this metropolis. And there's something about that I think that we've lost as a culture, the ability to imagine that far in the future. I mean, in that sense, anything we can do to, if not balance, or at least address the inequities between living in the countryside and living in the city, and to do so through both social and political and economic means, but also through design.
Muchas gracias. Creo que es una muy buena pregunta y también una muy buena reflexión, considerando el fenómeno de migración que vive hoy Monterrey, no nada más migración de nuestro estado, sino migración de otros estados e incluso de otros países, por todo este fenómeno que menciona el arquitecto Charles, también respecto a los trabajadores que van al norte en busca de empleo. Muchos de ellos se están quedando ahora en la ciudad de nosotros, y creo que es un fenómeno que nos va a beneficiar en gran medida en esta ciudad si lo entendemos correctamente. Muy buena pregunta y excelente comentario. No sé si haya otra del público o paso a la siguiente que hemos recibido. Si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta de la audiencia de Zoom, adelante. Muy bien. La siguiente pregunta que nos hacen es, al principio Charles Waldheim mencionó respecto a recomendar a las ciudades hacer mejores elecciones. Advising cities on the choices they should make. ¿Algún comentario en este sentido sobre cómo debe de hacerse esto para que realmente tenga eco dentro de las autoridades? I understand it as how to advise really a city. What do you could comment on that?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So we, our work is been primarily in the Americas. We've done work in Chile, in Argentina, in Colombia, quite a lot of work across the United States, and we have essentially three kinds of projects that we do. One type is we're interested in the relationship between solar performance and urban form. So one portfolio of work that we have is looking at solar impacts, solar energy production, and the shape of the city. Second portfolio we have looks at abandoned or obsolete transportation infrastructure. So abandoned airports. We were advising the city of Buenos Aires on the elevated highway across the Barrio 31, this kind of famous favela restructuring that they're engaged in just now, and their desire to take this obsolete highway and turn it into a public park. So we do quite a lot of that kind of work with the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, where we're advising cities on, so most cities have, two airports. They have a new one and an old one, and they don't know what to do with the old one, and they've never done it before. So we provide a kind of peer review, a set of international standards, this kind of thing. And then the third kind of work that we do is really about climate adaptation. So we've been working with the city of Miami. I've been working with a number of cities in the United States as they adapt to sea level rise. You know, Miami Beach has water in the streets every month just now. And this is in a state where the governor has said you cannot use the term climate change. So it's a very, you know, Miami is maybe the most extreme city in the United States for climate vulnerability. The major runways at Miami International Airport are at about +8 feet. This is like less than +3 meters above, you know, average sea level. So the limestone geology of South Florida also means you can't build a dike or a wall. You can't build a big, you know, dam. The water comes directly up out of the limestone. So it's in those kinds of places. What we're doing is we're providing a kind of peer review. We're providing a kind of international set of precedents and best practices, advising, you know, mayors or directors of city planning.
Okay, yes, here in Monterrey, I would say that we have the opposite problem. We are facing a drought season, which is really, really unprecedented. And the scarcity for water is coming for the next months. And as you have mentioned, people are in denial, and in a way, authorities also are. They speak about the crisis, but we don't see any actions, concrete actions on the way. And it's difficult to make the message across different stakeholders and the people themselves. And it's sometimes difficult for designers, architects, urbanists to see the problem coming or action that should be taken, and not being able to really make the authorities or the stakeholders or the people in charge implement those actions. However, it's always important to reflect on how to convey that message. The Academy is an ONG, and part of our, let's say, duty is to make those messages clear across the society.
I think so. We share this commitment with you. What I can say is, you know, most often, you know, people, not just politicians, but political leadership and real estate markets and individual homeowners or, you know, business leaders, they tend to have, of course, their own self-interest at heart, but they also tend to imagine a kind of continuity, or they all have an interest. You know, if you're selling real estate, or if you're the mayor of a town, or if you're a director of planning, you're imagining and reinforcing this sense that it's all going to be fine. Like we're going to be here, and there's more continuity. And so one of the exercises that we often engage in with our friends, as we call it, a scenario zero, where instead of coming in and saying we want to make change, or coming in and saying you've got big problems, we come in and we say, without value judgment, unconditional positive regard, here's what's happening. And we simply extrapolate that over many years forward. So if we just assume the population growth, growing land area, desertification, drought, climate change, you know, we play out a scenario of 10 or 20 years and say, well, Mr. Mayor, everything's great. In 2048, here's what your city will look like. And we're not proposing that that's a good thing, but we're simply visualizing, we're using our tools as architects to visualize, if we continue in this way, you know, and cities are, of course, as you know, the resultant of so many complex, you know, decisions. They're not linear. They don't operate that way. We have pandemics, and we have World Wars III, apparently, you know, so things change. But we find that by beginning not with a description of change or an indictment or a crisis, but rather just showing, here's what's happening, and assume that those things will continue to happen, you know, for the reasons that they're happening now, that can often change people's points of view, because they can see that, in fact, you know, their things are changing around them. Jorge, the question I have for you, based on the drought, I've been a consumer of Topo Chico lime water. This is getting us through the pandemic, and I'm told this comes from Monterey, and we consume this at an unsustainable rate. And I want to know,
Wow.
how is this possible? You're in drought and I'm drinking your water, and I feel bad about this.
Maybe it's because of the rate of export of the Topo Chico water.
Of course.
No, it's natural spring water. It's from a local source, and it's.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to hear that you like that kind of water, because it's also my favorite, and I guess that many of the audience also grow.
It's delicious.
By enjoying and consuming Topo Chico water.
I'm just hopeful that the profits are making their way back to Nuevo León, because I know that Jeff Bezos is getting quite a lot of money. We pay him monthly for this, but we've become, Sienna, my wife, and I have become, I think, addicted to this in the past 2 years. It's fantastic stuff.
Yes, and it's over 100 years old. They have a beautiful building. One of the members of the academy showed that it's a historic building where the original bottler for the spring water was. So it's interesting. Next time when you're visiting, another
pilgrimage site. I've had the Cabrito, and I've been to the automobile factories, and I've toured Monterey several times. It's a phenomenal city, great universities, wonderful people. But the Topo Chico plant, I have to visit next time.
Okay, you will be very, very welcome, and we will be very, very happy to have you whenever you happen to be back in Monterrey.
I wonder if it's like Guinness beer, like it's better when it's near the source. It must be, no?
Yes, it should be. It should be better because it's let's say fresher, but it's very, very typical of Monterrey, and it has a particular taste. And I'm again very glad to hear that, Charles. Okay, well, would you have any other questions from the audience? I think those are all the questions from YouTube. Anyone who would like to mention any other comment? Rena? No? Okay, well, I think those are all the questions that we have for today. And Ruben Segovia is raising a hand. Yes, Ruben, we hear you.
Hi, Charles. Thanks for the lecture. It was really good. And I just wanted to ask, you mentioned this idea of using culture as a way to challenge typological architecture and the typological modes of urbanization in a formal way, right? And also performative. Can you expand a little bit also the role of culture and tradition? Because it's more often than not, architects, we don't challenge the programs. The programs are always more or less a given. So what's the role of this new interpretation of culture and heritage in the placement of the program in those proposals, or the relationship between the programs, between themselves, and the performative aspect of the form in these proposals?
Thanks, Ruben. Thanks for the question. It's a good one. I think in this particular context in China, one of our first conversations, our first questions was, well, how will people live here? Like, what will they do? Like, why would one want to live in this way? And at the same time, the top-down, kind of nature of the political economy in China, the internal restrictions about movement, et cetera, the state has quite a number of levers. So what we decided to do was to try to find a way to environmentally protect or environmentally enhance the performance of these new towns while having them do less damage through erasure. And most of that, I think, would be relatively invisible to the citizenry, if you know what I mean. That is, we're not dictating like what people will be doing in terms of the programming, but the program is sort of a more normative or a more generic set of things. We're interested really in the mental image of where we think we live. So it's more the identity of the town. Going back to Kang Jianyu's Shenyang campus, the campus activities are more or less the same. They have classes and they have sports teams. And he hasn't really changed the content of the university, but he's changed the identity of the university. So in that sense, I think, living in, Jujube town is going to be, quite distinct and hopefully desirable, even though many of the things that you're doing in that town will be normative to any Chinese village. We're all living, in certain ways. So in that sense, it is true that program or activity tends to be habitual or vernacular. It tends to be what we do. And at the same time, we tend to approach urban form that way. Like we tend to approach urban form like there's a kind of pattern book, or whether it's the grid or whether it's the parcelization of ownership. In this unique case where there's state or collective ownership or large parcels of land and new towns are being built, if they're going to be built, our proposal is that we try to do so in a way that maintains something of the identity and therefore the meaning for these people. But it is at a very broad level. It's not really at the specifics of individual choice, let's say. And the economy, of course, of this species will lead to tourism and events, and some of the program will be specific to that plant. But a lot of the program and a lot of the lived experience won't be. But I think at the level of the visibility of the cultivation, that you will see the cultivation from every house, that the color of the town, the texture of it, that these things will have something of that. That's our goal. But at the same time, to try to be performative in a way, to be smart in terms of energy and smart in terms of climate response and these kinds of things. But those are things that I think would be more or less invisible to most of the people that lived here, and maybe even some of the decision makers as well.
Thank you. Bueno, ¿algún otro comentario, ya sea en español o en inglés? Muy bien, estamos a punto de terminar la sesión de hoy. Charles, would you like to add any other comment?
No, only to say gracias para todos, gracias a todos. Please come visit us in Cambridge. We hope to see you soon.
Yes. Well, agradecemos al arquitecto paisajista y urbanista Charles Waldheim que esta noche nos haya acompañado y compartido sus experiencias y conocimiento y tan emblemáticos proyectos. Me permito realizar un anuncio antes de terminar la sesión, para lo cual cedo la palabra a la arquitecta Rena Porsen, secretaria de nuestro capítulo.
Muchísimas gracias, Jorge. Este anuncio realmente es un gran honor y una gran alegría darle, porque en concordancia al reciente anuncio del gobierno del estado de Nuevo León sobre la reducción en los casos de incidencia de COVID y de acuerdo a que se va permitiendo a la vez mayores aforos en las instalaciones públicas y privadas del estado, les comunicamos con mucho gusto que a partir del siguiente mes de abril retomaremos las sesiones presenciales en nuestra sede, el auditorio del Museo de Historia Mexicana. Les esperamos, por lo tanto, a todos en nuestra siguiente sesión, que se llevará a cabo el día 4 de abril a las 19 horas en el auditorio del museo, y en la que tenemos el honor de tener como ponente el arquitecto Juan Carral, que nos visita desde la ciudad de Cancún, Quintana Roo. Ahí les esperamos.
Muchas gracias, Rena. Quiero agregar también otro aviso. El jueves tendrá un evento la plataforma Arquitectas MX, en el que se está invitando a toda la comunidad a participar. Pueden encontrar mayor información en redes sociales y acompañar a la introducción y presentación de la plataforma Arquitectas MX. Será el jueves 10 en la tarde en Trevor Park. Y bueno, pues de nuevo quiero agradecer al arquitecto Charles Waldheim esta sesión que nos deja muchísimos datos sumamente interesantes y reflexiones únicas de lo que es el futuro de las ciudades, del paisaje y también de lo que podemos aportar como arquitectos. Ha sido un gran honor tenerte como invitado, Charles, lo agradecemos muchísimo y agradecemos también a las escuelas que han participado en el concurso, y esta sesión tiene que ver mucho con nuestro concurso Gran Premio de Arquitectura Joven. Bien, siendo las 20 horas 12 minutos de la tarde, declaro concluida esta sesión. Muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes por su compañía. Muy buenas noches. Well, thank you again, Charles. I'm really looking forward for your visit to Monterrey. Anytime that you happen to be here, just give us a call to Rena, me, or anyone in the academy. We'll visit all these places, hopefully with your students here in Monterrey, or if we go to Cambridge, we will surely give you a call.
We will look forward to it, Jorge. Please let us know if you're here, and we'll give you a tour. I don't know what product we could have that would be anywhere good as Topo Chico. I have to admit this. That, we have our charms, but
yes.
Yeah, nothing quite so substantive as that. So, but thank you for your hospitality.
No. Thanks to you. Really, I'm looking forward for your book, 50 Cities. Also.
Yes. We would love to visit the library of Harvard School.
Wow.
That's definitely a plus.
We can do this.
Yes, we could do that, couldn't we? Yeah.
And also many new sites here in Monterrey at the universities. The Tadao Ando building in Universidad de Monterrey, and also a new art sculpture by James Turrell at the Monterrey Met.
Nice.
So nice things happening here in Monterrey.
But I remember when you invited me to Houston, and you had this group of students that they came to Mexico and stuff like that with the Rice University. I mean, if you're doing something like that, or some of your teachers will be very open to receiving you.
For sure. What a great idea.
Teacher.
What a great.
Yeah.
We've just gotten the announcement that we can take our masks off in 2 weeks, and we can begin to travel again.
Yeah.
So
it's going to be so great.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That is really necessary to open up again.
It's true.
Travel
it's true.
And just